Hello. Step inside a parish church and you will usually see a font, typically at the west end of the nave and near the entrance, symbolic of the beginning of Christian life. And throughout the medieval period, and for a long time after the Reformation, baptism was thought to be an essential rite of passage in order to avoid eternal damnation. So important that it could be done at home in an emergency. And midwives were licensed by the church into the mid-18th century in order to perform baptism, the only sacrament that could be administered by a layperson. And in the medieval period, everyone was baptised within a few days of birth, usually the first Sunday after the birth, given a Christian name, admitted to the fellowship of the church and the parish community. And being a godparent was a very serious business. In the Tudor period, 2 godfathers and 1 godmother for a boy, and vice versa for a girl, were typical. And fonts, of course, were designed for babies. But in the early days of Christianity, the converts were all adults. And rivers were used, reenacting the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist in the River Jordan. It probably wasn't full immersion. More likely water was poured over candidates. And Bede tells us that Paulinus, who was a member of the Gregorian mission, arrived in England in 601, baptised a large number of people in the River Trent. Fears of sanctified water being stolen for use in nefarious superstitious practices allegedly led to font covers being fitted from around about 1200. I don't know if this is true, but certainly during the 13th century, locks were being added to font covers. Now, the font style is a good indicator of the age when it was made. Early fonts were simple. By the 16th century and the Reformation, they've become much more elaborate. Chronologically, rounded tub-shaped fonts begin the sequence. This font is in St Chad's Church, Church Wilne in Derbyshire. It is possibly as early as 669 when Chad became Bishop of Lichfield. It's certainly not later than the 9th century. It's been damaged by fire, it's been worn by age, but you can still see the carving of a dragon surrounded by birds and an interlace pattern. This font is at the Church of the Holy Cross at Ilham in Staffordshire, probably late 11th century. It has these naive carvings of scenes from the legend of St Bertram, whose shrine is in this church. And Bertram supposedly became a hermit here after his wife was attacked and killed by wolves. This font is in St Mary's Church, Deerhurst in Gloucestershire. Dates to the 9th century, a tub font carved with spirals and vine scrolls. So we have these early tub fonts with carvings, but most tub fonts, certainly before the late 11th century, have little or no decoration beyond a cable or a chevron band. This example is in St Leonard's Church at Thorpe, and this font is in the Church of St Morwenna and St John, Morwenstow in Devon. And then during the 11th century, we get an evolution from that simple tub shape into a more wasted shape. This font is in St John's Church, Shobden in Herefordshire, has a carving of a lion. And Shobden Church is now in the care of a preservation trust. This is one of 2 fonts in the church. The church was extensively remodelled in the 18th century, had a new font to go with the remodelled church, but they retained their old one. The next development chronologically was pedestal fonts, where the bowl is set on a stand or on shafts. This example is at St George's Church, Anstey in Hertfordshire. Dates to the 12th century, and it's decorated with mermen who are holding up their tails. This example is from St Oswald's Church at Ashbourne. It's early 13th century, and it's decorated with pointed mouldings and stylised leaf motifs that are typical of the early Gothic architecture of this period. And at the same time as pedestal fonts appear, we also begin to see square bowls, rectangular panels ideal for decoration. This example is at St Peter's Church, Tickencote in Rutland. Dates to the mid-12th century and it's decorated with trailing vegetation above an arcade with face masks at the corner, and St Peter's is now in the care of the church's Conservation Trust. This example is St Mary's Church, Burnham Deepdale in Norfolk. Mid-12th century, it has depictions of the labours of the month, this annual cycle of traditional rural activities. From 1350, there is more uniformity in font design. Rectangular bowls go out of fashion and octagonal bowls become the most popular, and occasionally you find hexagonal bowls. And quite often those early fonts were thrown out because they were just seen as antiquated, out of date and replaced. A pedestal font from All Saints Church at Elton, dates to around 1200, was replaced, and it stood in the churchyard for many years until it was spotted by an enterprising vicar from All Saints Church at Yulgrave who snapped it up. And it's highly unusual in that it has this extra stoop which was possibly intended to hold holy oil. And beneath that projection and curling round the bowl there is a salamander. And in mythology, this legendary beast was supposed to be able to survive fire. And so it came to symbolise purity in virtue in the same way that baptism purified. Among the more sophisticated of the late medieval octagonal faults are those showing the 7 sacraments: baptism, the Eucharist, penance, confirmation, matrimony, taking holy orders and extreme unction, which left an 8th face, typically decorated by a crucifixion scene. This baptism panel is from a 7 sacrament font at St Bartholomew's Church, Slowly in Norfolk. Now, not surprisingly, 7 sacrament fonts suffered significantly at the Reformation. Sacraments became less important and only baptism and the Eucharist were recognised by Protestantism. So some 7 sacrament fonts were thrown out, others had their carvings chiselled off, as at Holy Trinity Church, Blythburgh in Suffolk. The 7 sacrament font from St John's at Tideswell for many years served as the parish paint pot. Now, probably 3/4 of parish churches still have their pre-Reformation font, and you'll often find that the font is the oldest item in a church. Post-Reformation, fonts don't follow any particular design pattern, but they do tend to be much smaller, which reflects the practice of merely sprinkling the infant rather than giving the babe a partial dunking. This font is in Christopher Wren's St Stephen's Walbrook in London, very finely carved with clean classical lines. And then with the Gothic revival of the Victorian era, we see a resurgence of medieval designs, and this 19th century font is in St Botolph's Church, Boston in Lincolnshire. Now, next time I'm going to take a look at the chapel at Haddon Hall, which at one time served as the parish church for Nether Haddon, and it brings together many of the features that we've covered so far in this series. If you've enjoyed this video, hit the like and subscribe buttons and click on the notification bell to be informed when the next video is available, or you can subscribe by clicking on the rose window over my shoulder.